Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement podcast. And with this being the first episode of the month, I am joined, as always, by Kelly Barner, owner and managing director of Buyers Meeting Point and general manager here at Art of Procurement. So first of all, Kelly, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Phil. Hi, everybody who's listening in. Thanks for having me.
So it's December already.
Yay!
Coming to the end of the year.
It's almost done.
I know.
We all get to take our calendars down and throw them out the window.
Yeah, what a weird, interesting, crazy year it's been.
Oh my gosh. And I think back in, February and March and then April, you do go into this very short term kind of mode where, you can do anything for an hour or a day or a week or something like that. And all of a sudden you realize we're in some ways about to loop on the impact of the pandemic, right? We're coming back up on, depending on how far in advance folks order their inventory, especially if they do business with companies in China, you're starting to rethink the whole, okay, what's our demand going to be for Chinese New Year, right? Because that's what saved a lot of companies during the initial shutdown, is that they had kind of planned ahead and brought in extra inventory. And it's not super far in the future that we're going to have to make those decisions again.
No, it's kind of crazy. You think back to February and how naive we were about what was to come.
I know.
And I think where we are now, for 2021, I think as everybody, looking forward to the new start. I don't think it's going to be plain sailing from the,
No.
the moment the calendar turns over to January the 1st, but maybe there's some light at the end of the tunnel. And, I'm excited for a lot of the things that we're working on, certainly moving forward, doing some new things, reimagining Mastermind. We've got that in the works. And looking forward to just getting some of those plans in action.
Absolutely. No, this is kind of a neat time of year to go into, because as a lot of the people in the Art of Procurement listening audience sort of step away a little bit, right, end of December, for us, that ends up being a fantastic time to really entrench on the things that we want to roll out early New Year. So I'm personally looking forward to getting down to work on that.
Yeah. Well, let's go into today's podcast. And in today's conversation, we both spoke to Diego de la Garza. Diego is a senior director at Corcentric, and he has a lot of expertise in the financial services category. Now, Corcentric, they're a leading provider of procurement solutions that transform how companies purchase, pay, and get paid. They're also members of the Art of Procurement Experts on Demand ecosystem, and they're sponsors of this once-a-month Ask the Expert series. And in today's conversation, Kelly and I discussed with Diego the current state of the financial services category, what the financial services category looks like, what it entails, how technology is impacting it, and how easy is it to switch providers once you are working with somebody. There's so much involved in this category that goes beyond the traditional, what's the price of something. So it's a fascinating category. So with all that being said, let's roll the tape with my first question to Diego, which as always was, did you find procurement or did procurement find you?
It's. I think we found each other. It's an interesting question. So just to give you a little bit of background, my academic background is in international business and trade, and so I initially went into just general business consulting, and then just kind of like my passion for working with companies and how they negotiate it and make the best out of the relationships that they were establishing was, what really drove me naturally into procurement, supply chain optimization, and sourcing. And just, it organically evolved from there.
And so, what would you say today, just for context for the listeners, is your day job? What do you spend most of the time doing right now?
Well, my role has evolved. So I started in procurement and strategic sourcing consulting about 10 or 11 years ago. Before that is when I was in just general business consulting. But as my role
Mm-hmm.
evolved and I started working on different categories with different customers, and started to focus really on a few categories, one of which was the financial services one, I started to create more just business driven objectives and goals for me, my group, and my organization. So today, I am the global services and delivery lead. So, for our source to pay organization, that means that I lead basically all the services and products that we have to offer at Corcentric on a global scale. So that means
Mm-hmm.
procurement advisory. That means strategic sourcing, category expertise, support some of the technology solutioning that we have. And I'm actually growing my team right now, trying to get into more of the Europe market, supporting our solutions there. But yeah, started working on strategic sourcing specific categories, and then going from there. So
Mm-hmm.
now more on the customer engagement, customer success side of things.
So when it comes to, you mentioned there the financial services category, I know that's the one that we really want to talk about a little bit today. How did financial services come about? How did you get involved in that category?
Sure. It was also a very organic approach to it. So I went to school for an MBA, and I specialized in finance. And so as I was working on the procurement and strategic sourcing advisory piece, as we had different customers come to us and ask for advice on categories that were just beyond your typical spend, indirect spend, categories like MRO and facilities and things like that, I went in just because my passion revolving around finance and accounting and things of that nature. And so I started looking into those things, and started building out best practices. I started working on some initial categories in a very organic way. And so my finance background tied to procurement, as well as the
Mm-hmm.
relationships that we had with our customers earlier on, just kind of led us there organically, and we built up from there. So we started maybe with one client and one or two categories, and now we have a much more developed practice against it, and certainly some people in my team are focused on it as well, and continue to build up the thought leadership for us.
So when it comes to financial services as a category, are there some, we often find with a lot of these categories that the definitions of them and the scope of them can mean different things to different people,
Sure.
just based on your context, essentially. So when it comes to financial services, what would you class as being kind of the primary sourcing categories in the financial services space, and that you support?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So I would say that the way that we look at this category overall is important, so we can define, how we qualify or classify the categories. But the way that we do it is by understanding how monies are captured and then distributed by an organization. So, whether that organization
Mhm.
is assessing specific cost attributed to those specific activities, then we classify, financial services into different subcategories, and we will have different strategies and different levers tied to each one of them. So, when I talk about how a company's capturing money, we call that intake. And when we're talking about distribution, we call that disbursement. And so there's typically two main categories that your audience might be familiar with. On the intake side, it's typically merchant accounts, for example. That's the most common one, in which
Mhm.
we, look at how organizations, especially those that have retail operations or some sort of sales operations on the business to consumer side, are, intaking payment, whether it's, on a
Yeah.
POS, brick and mortar store, or online, how they're capturing, credit card information, processing payment that way. And so, that merchant accounts operation is evolving rapidly, and it's one of the more popular ones. For us, we typically negotiate
Mm-hmm.
the what's called the interchange plus plus. So the cost for those organizations to be able to take and process a payment. And so there's different providers from financial services side that would charge what's called the interchange fee, as well as IT providers who provide technology and
Yeah.
software solutions. So that takes place on the disbursement side. What we look at, and it's also very popular category, is the corporate payment programs. So that's how you pay suppliers, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're talking about your P card providers, ACH. It's more of a typical banking relationship, from a business to business perspective.
Yeah.
And that's going to be very different in terms of what we look at and how we negotiate. So that is more about compliance, is more about the signing bonuses, performance bonuses that may be in place. We negotiate rebates. It's a little bit of a different strategy altogether from a procurement advisory perspective. And then there's a couple more that tend to be popular, but it will depend on the industry, right? So one of them is financial instruments. So one of the things that we look at when it comes down to companies or organizations that are big builders of new real estate and things like that, or just simple organizations who are trying to bring in a renovation to their facilities and things of that, like, are the uh, capex related type of lines of credit and those
Mm-hmm.
types of things that we look at reducing their cost of borrowing as well. And it can be something that we can do through strategic sourcing and benchmarking, just like we would treat any other category. So that's popular for companies that have big capex, and they use
Yeah.
their banks to support those financial instruments. Um, and then the last one that I would say, it's another category specifically, in which we've been very successful in the past with insurance companies, what we call claims recovery services. So you think about things like subrogation. There are
Yeah.
companies that would be able to negotiate a lower cost to conduct those types of activities. And so it's pretty popular, again, with insurance firms and companies, and we have really good benchmarks in the past that have taught us quite a bit around claims recovery services and things of that like. So those are typical subcategories within the financial services space that we've been very successful, that are pertinent to multiple industries, multiple companies of all sizes, and the ones that I would
Right.
highlight as our flagship, so to speak.
So when you look, there's a broad range, and first, thank you for answering that. It gives a lot more color to the kind of subcategories that are involved, and there's a big kind of a broad range between whether it's, like you said, the intake, the disbursements, financial instruments, the claims recovery. I think about, how do you group those all into one to talk about a marketplace? As you're thinking about the things on the intake side, so it's merchant accounts, for example, credit card processing. What are the kind of drivers of the market, that determine what kind of deal that somebody gets? Is it, in fact, I'll just leave it there. What kind of drivers do you see that impact price, that impact cost on
Yeah.
those categories?
Yeah, so one of the things that is very interesting, and really what brings my passion to this financial services category, is that it is not a simple category in which you can simply go and run a sourcing event and call it a day. Every
Mm-hmm.
company will have a very unique, what I call, footprint of their transaction profile, which means you're in the intake piece and credit card processing. You, depending on what you sell and how you sell it as a company, you are going to have a different number of transactions and a different average transaction value. So if you think about a sports goods type of company, they're going to have a lot more transactions that are a lot lower. So people are buying
Mm-hmm.
sneakers, t-shirts, that type of thing. You're looking at $50 to $100 maybe on an average transaction ticket. It's what's called. But you might have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of transactions a year. Whereas if you look at something that is more services driven, you might see the opposite, where you see an average ticket of thousands of dollars and transactions in much lower numbers. And so those combinations are what's going to drive the commercial proposal from different providers, right? Because they're going to look at how much and how they can charge for that. So when you look at the interchange plus, which is the pricing model that many of these companies will use, they're going to say, well, we're going to charge a percent on the value of the transaction, and we're going to charge a specific dollar value to each transaction, right? And so that's how you start looking at how to balance that act and making sure that you get the best possible proposal on the table that, based on your specific profile, you're not going to be, spending more. And there's a lot of different ways, providers price their services, and they might, come with a just per transaction. Some of them may come with a percentage on the ticket, and some of them come with a mix of both. So it is important to know what drives and what are the different levels for those particular activities, so that the right negotiation can take place. But merchant accounts and credit card processing is one of those things that it's hard to benchmark because every profile will be different. But it is very, very good to look into, because not a lot of companies are, and that's a big gap, and that's why we're able to produce a good amount of value for our customers in that particular category.
And I imagine that the ticket price, the size of the ticket, is going to determine which is the best approach, whether it's a fixed transaction fee versus percentage versus a hybrid.
Exactly.
So are you seeing kind of disruptive technologies that's kind of redefining this marketplace? It's something that I'm sure payment processing has stayed the same for a long time, and as with everything, technology is really changing things pretty quickly. And I imagine it's the same in financial services as it is in other categories.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think what is really the biggest driver in changing the equation a little bit more these days is around technology, and the ability to integrate that technology into the broader technology strategy of an organization, right? So in the intake piece, the credit card processing, it's revolving a lot around what's called an omni-channel, right? It's the ability to take payment anywhere in the world into one single platform. And as you've seen just on your personal card, there now there's a chip. There 10 years ago that wasn't there. Now you don't even need a credit card. You can pay with your phone, and you don't have to punch in or slide or do anything with a card anymore. And so that type of technology is driving behaviors, and you can see that even in a business to business side as well, right? And how companies are now also changing the way they pay suppliers. So that's the other side of the equation, and one that it's evolving quick. And as you know, being in the procurement space now, the procure to pay technology is basically the newest trend, and where everybody is going nowadays. So it's going to be different year over year. That is the biggest disruptor I'm seeing, and where I see procurement, accounts payable and IT coming in together like they've never done before. So both on the intake as well as in the disbursement side of things, technology is I wouldn't say is being disruptive. I think it's driving catalysts to changing some behaviors in the way that we either support our clients in them taking payments or paying their suppliers.
Well, and it's interesting, Diego, when you talk about, you mentioned accounts payable and IT with regard to the technology component of financial services. It would be very easy and simplistic to say, all right, what are the internal relationships associated with managing this? You say, okay, the CFO, the financial team. But a lot of the things that we've discussed so far have not only been nuanced within finance, they also have tremendous impact on a company's ability to do business. Are there a few internal relationships, whether on a title role with an individual or functionally that you have seen play an incredibly important role in procurement's ability to be successful at bringing this spend under management?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that, as I mentioned before, the relationship between procurement and accounts payable is becoming a natural one from a source to pay perspective. But there's a few more. So there's a relationship between procurement and finance, which there's a lot
Mm-hmm.
of talk about, and everybody has an opinion on it. But a lot of CPOs and heads of procurement are now either reporting into the CFO role, or now
Yeah.
they have what we call a seat at the table, right? Meaning that they are being elevated to the C-suite. And in the most recent trends that I've been reviewing, even the role of a chief value officer, right? And what that really means to the organization,
Okay.
which is how finance and procurement, when they come together, they do have a direct impact on EBITDA, and working capital. And so that is just the way that an organization and a business operates. So when you're able to recognize that procurement working on categories like financial services can actually deliver value and impact EBITDA and working capital directly, then natural relationships and synergies are created. And so the very first one I would say is finance and procurement, right, at a high level. Procurement not longer being a tactical and almost transactional entity within a business, but a strategic one. And then the other one is going to be IT, right? So there's
Okay.
all sorts of solutions now come into place. You have your ERPs, and then you have supplier relationship management platform sitting on top of that. You have source to pay technologies like the solutions that we offer sitting on top of ERP, and spend analysis. All these types of things that are all procurement driven technologies that are feeding from and
Mm-hmm.
to financial technologies. And all this is concerning to IT, right? Because now you're dealing with
Right.
data data points and compliance issues and data risk management that you
Mm-hmm.
didn't have 10 years ago. And regulations are changing, and you have more responsibilities to safeguard some of that data that it wasn't there before. So supplier data, supplier banking information, all those types of things still reside in the business responsibility, even more so than the IT provider. So those relationships need to be in lockstep. That being the finance, procurement, and IT today more than ever before, and it's not going to change, right? It's going to continue to create that synergy for
Right.
the organization. So those are, probably not from a title perspective, but certainly from a
Sure.
responsibility and role perspective, what I would see is becoming more and more relevant.
Now, when you think about the supplier side of managing this spend, what are the types of supplier relationships that you tend to see companies have? I mean, do they tend to be situations where there is leverage there, right, based on relative differences in sizes? Are you to a certain extent, at the whim of the established players out there because risk and reputation are such a concern? What do the dynamics between companies and their suppliers in financial services tend to be like?
So I can tell you that, when we first started looking at this category in general, it was very different than it is today. And back then, these relationships with these suppliers, which are financial institutions, right, namely banks, were very sensitive, and they were grandfathered in by, the first president of the company or CFO, and the company just maintained those. And it's reasonable to think that because they're managing money, and primarily how that money impacts the organization. So nobody really wanted anybody but the CFO to handle that relationship, or those relationships. In some cases, there are multiple banks or multiple financial institutions
Right.
providing services. And so when we came in as procurement advisors or consultants and say, hey, we could probably help you normalize and rationalize some of that, and deliver some value, whether that is cost avoidance or savings, or even, like I mentioned before, rebates and performance bonuses and things like that. It was a hard conversation to have. But ultimately, I believe that the organizations and the companies that we worked with realized that it was just a natural evolution of things, and those relationships, yes, very sensitive, but it was more important for the business to continue to drive value through those relationships than keeping the relationship with a specific bank just because is the one that's always been in place. So
Mm,
I believe that as long as there's a business case and data that proves that there's opportunity to be in a better situation. It behaves in many ways as other categories would. Now things are different today, also in the way that IT again is involved, right? So now, there's much more conversation around how a specific financial services provider is complying with certain regulations, with certain
yeah.
controls and certain requirements that IT may have, and all those things are going to be very, very heavily tied to the organization's culture, and their business nature as well. So some companies deal with more sensitive information than others, or if you think about government contractors, those relationships are going to be critical, both from a banking perspective, and security of the data perspective, as well as just IT
Hmm.
controls, right? So uptime and SLAs and those types of things are things that before you didn't really care much about how many days a week the bank was open. Now your bank is virtual, so
Right.
it's an IT solution, and you want to make
Okay.
sure that if you're issuing payment or you are expecting payment to be provided to you based on a daily batch or anything like that, like the merchant accounts categories typically
Hmm.
would work. You want to make sure that those things are working 24/7. So the conversations evolved from, hey, this is the relationship that I had before, and I always use this particular bank, to which one's the most secure solution for our business, and that's from a process
Hmm.
perspective as well as from an IT perspective. And we've seen it all. I mean, I've competed, banks and the likes of American Express to a regional bank for a publicly traded company, and having the regional bank win the business just because it was a better fit, right? It's not
Okay.
anymore that, well, if you go with the big name, you're going to get the better deal. It's not even that. It's
Right.
what is the right relationship for this particular scope, and that to me is almost looking at banking and financial services in the same light as you look at supplier relationship management. You bring in the right company for the right reasons, and you maintain that relationship and manage to that relationship based on specific performance metrics. Um, you know, Bringing in the Bank of Americas and the Wells Fargo's of the world. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing against them. I have accounts with all those three banks that I mentioned. But
Sure.
they have a different competitive advantage, and that's how banks are differentiating themselves now in supporting smaller and larger organizations. And so that's what we as procurement professionals need to be looking at: is what is the right set of requirements, what's the right provider who can fulfill those requirements,
Hmm.
and then what is the business case that the company needs to make to either um, make a switch or argue for business as usual.
Well, and to that point, you actually had mentioned this a minute or two ago, and I wanted to come back to it. And now you sort of bring it up here. When you look at supplier relationships within financial services, how costly? I mean, really, in every sense of the word, how difficult or costly is it when you think about switching suppliers in this spend category, and whether that means the literal cost of making a switch, or all of the associated complications and the overhead and potentially even risk or delay that come along with making a change. Is it harder than the average category to switch suppliers in financial services, or for a mature professional procurement organization, is it relatively the same as long as you're minding the details?
Um, it's a great question, and I don't want to say it depends. although it does depend on a few different things. I can tell you what are the variables that we look at in terms of how easy it is to make a switch or not. The first one is culture. I think a lot of organizations do feel more comfortable working with larger organizations and do feel comfortable working with the relationships that they have already established. These relationships operate
Okay.
at a really high level, right? So it's very relationship driven, and one of the most important elements I've seen for these types of relationships is who is handling your relationship and how is your relationship being handled, right? So when you think about a typical category, if you're buying, say MRO products, there might not be much
Hmm.
of a relationship, personal relationship between, the buyer or the category manager and the provider. There might be some for sure, but it might not be incredibly ingrained. With banking relationships, it's typically going to be the CFO or a senior level official at an organization who holds the relationship with, a counterpart at the financial services provider, which it's going to be heavily reliant on how that relationship is working, how the service is been delivered, value adds, and those types of things. So from that perspective, culture will matter a lot. Some
Hmm.
business leaders are more and more pragmatic than before, and so they want to make sure that while they can continue to maintain those relationships outside of the business, that the business is actually getting the right solution. And so when that is brought to the table, then it's not that much more complicated than switching, to any other provider in a different category. But it also depend on the scope, right? And so I think that's what's really important here to consider. If you're thinking about a global organization who wants to deploy an omni-channel for merchant account services, then there's a cost for the technology. There's going to be a cost for training. There's going to be a cost for onboarding suppliers and users, as well as the cost of the running the, um, the selection process itself. Now, what some financial institutions do is what I call they buy the business, and so a lot of companies will be willing to provide the company with pretty hefty bonuses, whether it's a signing bonus or a performance bonus upfront in the negotiation to make sure that any cost that is assessed by the company for making the switch is absorbed by the financial
Hmm.
services provider. Ultimately, you think about it, if you have a 3-year contract and you throw in a few hundreds of thousands of dollars in bonuses, that may offset the cost of switching. After 3 years, it's likely that you're going to renew and you're capturing that business for definitely more than 3 years. So it's definitely a win-win situation. What I've seen that's interesting though is a lot of organizations, they do see the value in getting an extra check in the mail that they can use to buy equipment or more software, or even pay for overhead salaries, whatever they use that money
Hmm.
for. They are tied to specific performances. So like when you think about a corporate payment program, companies would say we'll give you 50,000, $100,000 every year, so long that there's a certain amount of money flowing through our system. And that's what companies that monitor. So you go in with an expectation that you're going to get a bonus, but then you're not compliant with the regulation or the delineation of that bonus, and that's where some of those things get lost, and that's where things become expensive. So it's a long-winded way of saying it depends, but there's different variables. Like I said, culture, the operation, the complexity of the particular
Yeah.
category or project. But if all things are held equal, I would say it's just as complicated as any other um, project on a different category would be if it's run correctly.
So I have a last question, Diego, because I know it's coming up to time to wrap up. But it's a lot of these categories, um, they're volume based. You mentioned the fact that a lot of those financial institutions are looking for how much money, how much transaction volume, whatever it is you're going to pass through. And obviously, there's some organizations which don't have the benefit of a high number of transactions, a high spend through a P card or whatever it may be. For those organizations that aren't the largest, what are some ways that they can still make an attractive proposition for a financial institution, whether it's one of the larger ones or a smaller ones, where they're still somebody who, a potential provider wants to do business with, as opposed to just looking and saying, you know what, those are pretty low volumes, I'm not really that interested?
That's a very good question. So what I would say to that is smaller organizations who don't have huge volumes can think about different services to be bundled in. So rather than saying we're going to use one company for our credit card processing and another one for our treasury services, and we also have a banking relationship for our capital expenditures, then you can think about going at it a little bit differently and say, okay, this is what we do, this is how we operate, and then let the financial services provider or bank solution for you and say, if we are to take on, all these areas of the business, then we can be much more competitive. And they would do that, right? Now, the caveat here, and you're probably thinking about this already, is putting all your eggs in one basket. What happens if there's a major issue with a particular bank, and we've known, in the past few years that a couple of banks have gone through some of those issues. What do you do there, right? And so there's two pieces. One is, I would recommend for financial services providers to, or rather for customers who are looking at financial services providers, to have not necessarily a backup, but maybe dual source their operation, so that they have another bank, so to speak, who can step in if something was to happen rather quickly. So similar competing and similar banks. It's a very typical approach, but you still segment the product, so to speak. In other words, you don't give your merchant accounts scope to two different vendors. You give your merchant account services to, let's say, one, and then you give your other treasury services or your financial instruments or your regular banking to another institution, knowing that either of them can step in and take over rather quickly. So it provides that acceleration. And if you need another person to come in, take a quick look and undertake that, it's much easier than trying to switch everything from scratch. From scratch, exactly.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And, giving them enough that at least it keeps them interested, does then give you some leverage if time comes when you want to switch, 2-3 years down the line or whatever that may be.
Right.
They're not the sole source, the only game in town.
Exactly.
So the very last question, and I always say this is the easy question, Diego, is that if listeners would like to reach out and connect with you, learn a little bit more, or what would be the best place for them to find you?
LinkedIn is definitely something I'm very active on. It's where we operate now, and that should be pretty easy for everybody. And our Corcentric website has also a good amount of information. So if it's not me, somebody from my team will be happy to connect on either platform.
Okay, perfect. Well, what I'll do is I'll include links to your LinkedIn profile and also to the Corcentric website on our show notes page for today's episode. That's going to be if listeners go to artofprocurement.com/podcast. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast, and you'll find the show notes for this podcast, along with all the others that we have on Art of Procurement right there. So one last time, first of all, Kelly, I want to thank you for joining and asking some of the questions today to Diego.
Thanks very much. Glad to be here.
And Diego, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Kelly. Appreciate the opportunity.